Okay, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, welcome and thanks today for coming to today's session celebrating Black History Month, reflecting on our histories and our futures. So this year for Black History Month, the theme as set by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. So for our session today, we'd like to reflect on the intersections of the Black family and families from other identities. This event is just one event in a series that was developed in collaboration with several organizations with the intent to grow community, share our individual and collective stories, and showcase expertise of GIS professionals of the African diaspora. So for the next 45 minutes or so, you're going to learn about several examples of how Black history, Black culture, and Black people have influenced and impacted the histories and present day experiences of folks and other marginalized groups. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means for, in terms of workplace and the economics today. Throughout the presentation, we're also going to offer moments of reflection on some of the issues or topics that we've talked about related to the history we've discussed. And, we'll give you a moment to think about how you participate in those things or are affected by them. A couple of disclaimers. We are not historians. We're just people who work somehow in the field of GIS who wanted to make space to celebrate Black history. So be kind, be conscientious of that. And just as another kind of disclaimer, it wasn't until very recently, right, when we started to become much more societally awakened to the importance of inclusive language. So you will see a couple of times we have edited historical quotes to, change with brackets to be more inclusive, specifically to include people from genders beyond just men and women. So my name's Sarah Scher. I'm a solution architect at Esri. I co-lead the LGBTQIA group, ERG at Esri.
My name is Aisha Jenkins. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm a project manager here at Esri, and I am one of the co-leads of NorthStar.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria Patino. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am the founder and leader of Claro, an employee resource group for Latinx employees.
Hello, I am Dorothea Cooper. My pronouns are she and her. I'm project manager at Here Technologies and co-lead our Black African Employee Resource Group, Unity and Power.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe Tereslina. My pronouns are she, her, and I co-lead the Asian, Desi, and Pacific Islander Employee Resource Group at Esri.
I can't believe that I forgot to say my pronouns as the co-lead of LGBTQIA. My pronouns are she, her. So the purpose for today is to create space for all of us to remember and reflect on the impacts of Black history, culture, and people have had on all of our daily lives and experiences. We want to think about present day activism and what that can mean for our future. And again, think about what that means for us individually, as people. We're hoping that in telling these stories and contextualizing history a little bit differently and probably telling you history that you haven't heard before. I mean, I know I hadn't heard most of this before. So we hope to, decompartmentalize Black history and hope to illustrate how Black history really is all of our histories. We hope that we can encourage cross-racial solidarity and action to end racism, and to show that being anti-racist isn't just something that only civil rights leaders can be, right? It is something that everyone listening in today can choose to be in a given moment or around making a given decision. And we're actually going to provide you with some decisions you can make at the end of this presentation, for yourselves. So without further ado, I'll kick it off to Chloe, and she'll talk about Black and Asian, Desi, and Pacific Islander history.
So just to start things off here, some background on Asian, Desi, and Pacific Islander history that was happening in tandem with Black history. And for those of you who don't know, Desi means people who are from the Indian diaspora. So this history really starts with slavery in colonial California, and it began with the enslavement of indigenous people, actually. But without the ruthless slave patrols that existed in the South and on the East Coast in California, the system of slavery was really hard to maintain. So following the Emancipation Proclamation, the US needed another form of cheap labor. So their answer to this was recruiting thousands of Chinese workers to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And this was because these workers were seen as expendable. They were given the most dangerous jobs. And when their usefulness was over, American media quickly turned on them and blamed them for taking jobs to appease white workers who really felt threatened by this new population of people. And because of this, white mobs actually lynched Chinese migrants, committed multiple massacres, and burnt down Chinatowns. And the climax of anti-Asian sentiment really resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this was the first discriminatory immigration law in American history. So in the 1880s to the 1900s, while this was all going on, after the Spanish-American War, Hawaii was now a US territory. And that means that they were subject to the Emancipation Proclamation and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they now needed a new form of labor. So Chinese and later Japanese and Filipino laborers actually were brought to Hawaii to work on plantations. And then over the next few decades, these laborers were subject to terrible treatment. They faced a lot of racism. They did a lot of backbreaking jobs, working long hours, and were frequently beaten and killed by police anytime they tried to strike to demand better working conditions. So in 1924, another act was passed that expanded the limitations on immigration from various Asian countries that were seen as undesirable. So at this point, you might notice a pattern of American history just being marked with the cycle of big businesses relying on cheap immigrant labor at the expense of human rights, which turns the white working class against them, with their fears being fueled by politicians, by media, looking for someone to blame for problems. We see this to this day. And this idea of yellow peril, which is what this concept is called, that's just rooted in xenophobia, is something that we see as a narrative that seems to always be readily available for fearful Americans. And unfortunately, we see this pattern continue now with the 800% to 1200% increase in violent hate crimes committed against Asian Americans in the midst of a pandemic that they had nothing to do with. So we just felt like we needed to acknowledge that here as well. So following all of that, in the 1940s, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt spurred the forced removal and incarceration of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps during World War II. And this was based on the fears that they still maintained ties to the Japanese government. During this time, they were forced to harvest sugarcane during the war in labor camps, and to actually gather all of Japanese people during this time, the US actually inappropriately used census data to target this community. And for some Japanese Americans, it's the reason they don't fill out the census to this day. In recent years, we actually saw this again in 2001, where the Census Bureau provided data to the Department of Homeland Security to identify Arab American neighborhoods following 9/11. So it's interesting how history seems to have this way of repeating itself. In 1943, then Congress repealed all Chinese exclusion laws and granted Chinese people the right to become citizens. And the main motivation for this was not an act of kindness. It was because the US Army actually needed bodies and drafted over 20% of Chinese men living in the United States soon thereafter. And then in the 1960s, African American activists were really helping create Asian America as we know it today. I just want to acknowledge that Asian America was only made possible because in history, Asian, Desi, and Pacific Islander people stood on the shoulders of Black, Brown, and Native people in the work that they did. So the civil rights movement really helped force the end of racist immigration laws. And as a result, so many more people were able to become citizens and vote. So without that, we would not have any of those rights to this day. And then moving, I guess, toward more recent history, in 1971, the Polynesian Panther Party was founded, and this was a revolutionary social justice movement to target racial inequities that were carried out against indigenous Maori people and Pacific Islanders, and this was in modern-day Auckland, New Zealand. And then similarly, the Dalit Panther movement was founded, and this was a liberation movement started in Bombay to protest India's caste system. And they felt very aligned and inspired by Black Power activism. So we just wanted to note that Black Panther movement did not end at any time. In fact, it inspired many more movements across the US and across the world as well. So for reflection here, we chose a quote from Yuri Kochiyama, and this is, so transform yourself first because you are young and have dreams and want to do something meaningful. That in itself makes you our future and our hope. Keep expanding your horizon, decolonize your mind, and cross borders. And for some context, Yuri Kochiyama was put in a Japanese internment camp, and she became a Black nationalist when she moved to Harlem in the 1940s. And she regularly had activists come speak in her home, one of which was Malcolm X, who actually came to talk with survivors of the atomic blasts in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And she spent her life really advocating for that cross-racial solidarity, particularly between Asian Americans and African Americans. So our reflection questions here, when you think about this quote, are first off, how did you learn about colonization? Second, how has that influenced the way you view the world? And then last, how can you evolve your way of thinking from what you were initially taught? So I'm going to pause while we all quietly reflect on this, and then we'll move on to the next portion.
Thank you, Chloe. So now we're going to be moving on to looking into Black history and Latinx history. Latinx were subject to discriminations and civil rights abuse that led many of them to organize, strike, and protest. I decided to highlight some historical events that were catalysts to Latinx civil rights movements that happened across the US in the 1960s. In 1942, thousands of Latinos, including 350,000 Mexican Americans and 53,000 Puerto Ricans, served in World War II. When they returned from war, Latinos felt their efforts and sacrifices during the war had earned them equal rights. But like many other minority groups in the United States, they faced discrimination when they returned from war. On the slide here, we see a sign that says, Americanos todos luchamos por la victoria. American all, we all fight for victory. One person that served during World War II was Cesar Chavez, who I'll be talking about a little bit on the next slides. In 1942, the Bracero program was established. This was an agreement between the US and the Mexican government that permitted Mexican citizens to temporarily work doing agricultural labor in the United States. This, of course, was prompted by the enormous manpower shortage that was created by World War II. This agreement was expected to be a temporary effort, but it wasn't terminated until 1964, more than 19 years after the end of World War II. This agreement had stipulations regarding health, housing, food, and wages, and specifically the working hours, but most were disregarded by the US government and the growers. The braceros suffered all types of abuse. For example, upon arrival to the United States, the people were taken into processing centers and they were sprayed with DDT by the Department of Agriculture personnel. Segregation of Latinx was also noticeable in restaurants, theaters, and schools. Some restaurants had signs that prohibited the entrance of Mexican, like the one that we see on the slide. These signs were distributed by the Lone Star Restaurant Association in Dallas, and they hung for decades throughout the United States until the 1960s. Operation Wetback took place in the US in 1953. This US Immigration Service arrests and deports more than 3.8 million Latin Americans. Many of them were US citizens and they were deported unfairly. More than 25% apprehended Mexicans were returned to Veracruz. Many of them were not even from Veracruz and they were taken on cargo ships. As you can imagine, many of them did not even make the trip. Those people that were apprehended were often deported without the opportunity to recover the property that they had purchased in the United States, and they weren't allowed to contact their families that they left behind in the United States. In 1945, Mexican-American parents sued several California school districts and challenged the segregation of Latino students. The California Supreme Court ruled in the parents' favor in the Mendez versus Westminster case. This paved the way for the historic Brown versus Board of Education case that was decided by the US Supreme Court in 1954. So these historical events that I mentioned, can we go to the next slide? That I mentioned were key factors that influenced the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In 1965, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta founded the United Farm Workers Association, which went on to become the largest and most important farm worker union in the nation. Some of us may even be familiar with the amazing work that Dolores Huerta continues to lead with the Dolores Huerta Foundation. In 1960, we see the Chicano movement takes place, also referred to as el movimiento. This was a social and political movement inspired by prior acts of resistance among people of Mexican descent. This movement worked to embrace the Chicano identity that prior to this movement was a very classist term of derision. I have to work on that. But they they worked to combat structural racism and encourage cultural revitalization. And it encouraged the community to reject assimilation and to take on this term and be proud of it. The Chicano movement was heavily influenced by the Black Power movement. Both of them collaborated on different events, and they also called for Black and Brown unity. In 1967, the Brown Beret chapters was formed in the neighborhoods of Los Angeles. They responded to similar social oppressions like state-sanctioned violence and inferior schooling conditions. They created a 10-point program that was inspired by the 13-point program of the Black Panthers, and they demanded many different things like the right to vote regardless of the ability to speak English or not. The Black Panthers and Brown Berets found it essential to call for inclusivity history that challenged the Mediterranean narrative that left Chicanos and Blacks at the margins of American society. And they expressed that it was important to tell history right in schools. Political demonstrations like the East LA walkouts and the Chicano moratorium occurred in collaboration with Black students and activists. In 1968, the Young Lords was formed by Puerto Rican youth in Chicago. It was led by Jose Cha-Cha-Cha Jimenez. The Young Lords actually evolved from a gang into an activist organization. During the summer of 1968, Jimenez became politicized thanks to a Black Muslim man who was a prison librarian. Jimenez began learning about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party. Another movement that I want to highlight is that took place in 1969 by Los Siete de la Raza. These were 7 Central American youths, the ages between 16 and 20 years old, from San Francisco's Mission District. They were accused of killing a police officer on May 1st, 1969. Their 18-month trial and their eventual acquittal was a key moment in the awakening of consciousness for the Latinx community in the Bay Area. Several students that were supporting the case, they decided to create a newspaper called Basta Ya as a tool for getting the word out to the community about the case, but at the same time about reporting other issues that impacted the Latinx community in the neighborhood and around the country. The Black Panther Party provided free space for Basta Ya in the reverse of their own newspaper. They also provided advice to Donna Amador, who was the founder of Basta's Yes editorial, and they just provided advice on how to circulate the word and how to create a newspaper. On one of the issues of the Black Panther newspaper, there was a message of solidarity from Panther founder Huey Newton. On the message, at the end of the message, there was a phrase that said, Black power to Black people, brown power to brown people, power to all the oppressed people of the world. The organization of Siete de la Raza distinguished itself from other Latinx organizations that were primarily focused on Chicanos, which are people from Mexican descent. They saw commonalities of other oppressed people, including Black, Asian American, and Native people. So for them, it was important to highlight all the issues that were going on. Can we move on to the next slide? So now we're gonna be reflecting for a moment. And to provide a little bit of background on this reflection, in 1968, Cesar Chavez lent his voice to a strike for grape workers organized by the Agricultural Workers Organization Committee, which was predominantly a Filipino labor organization. On this reflection, it's an excerpt from the letter to Delano, where Cesar Chavez wrote to the president of the California Grape and Tree Fruit League. So I'll go ahead and read the reflection. We are men and women who have suffered and endured much, and not only because of our abject poverty, but because we have been kept poor. The color of our skin, the language of our cultural and native origins, the lack of formal education, the exclusion from the democratic process. All these burdens, generation after generation, have sought to demoralize us. We are not agricultural impediments or rented slaves. We are men. What are the commonalities of the struggles of these marginalized communities who came from very different histories of oppression? And what can we learn from these movements, and what can they offer for us today? So we'll take a moment to reflect.
Okay, thanks, Maria. So the LGBTQ community has frequently shown, right, that despite being discriminated against for being gay or queer, our members, the members of our community are fully capable of discriminating internally as well. Historically, as a community, we have failed to address the most marginalized of us, including LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness who are disproportionately Black and Latinx. We've paid insufficient attention and action around the fact that HIV and AIDS disproportionately affects Black, gay, and bisexual men. There's been very consistent erasure of the impacts and role of Black LGBTQ people in our community's history, especially during the Stonewall riots, which was largely led by Black trans women. If any of you are familiar with the 2015 film Stonewall, this is a really good example of the whitewashing of LGBTQ history. And historically and presently, our community suffers from discrimination and violence against Black LGBTQ people, especially Black trans people in our own spaces. And this isn't just a historical challenge, right? This hasn't gone away. Only a few years ago in my city of Philadelphia, in our neighborhood's gayborhood, which is a collection of like 10 or so gay bars and venues, was exposed just, I think in 2017 as being, as discriminating against non-white patrons, ranging from management and owners and customers using racial slurs to denying entry to patrons who weren't white, with trans women of color especially being vulnerable to discrimination, harassment, and physical violence. So in steps Amber Hikes, who's this woman you see on the slide, a Black queer woman who was the executive director of the Office of LGBT at the City of Philadelphia. She's now the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at the ACLU. But at the time, she fought for advocating for the most impacted populations of our community. So really doing kind of the opposite of what we have, what we failed to do in the past on this slide, right? So she was fighting for the youth, elders, immigrants, transgender people, people experiencing homelessness, and of course, people of color. In her time leading office, Amber advocated for anti-discrimination legislation at the municipal level. She successfully was able to get past one of the nation's most trans-inclusive policing policies, which significantly decreased the police harassment of trans people, especially Black trans women in the city. And maybe most famously, she is responsible for creating the More Color, More Pride flag with the black and brown stripes that you've probably been seeing a lot of the past year or so, which really prompted an international conversation about race and discrimination within the LGBTQIA community. So I'd like to offer a moment of reflection. This is a quote by James Baldwin. "It's simply one more aspect of the danger in which all Black people live. I think white gay people feel cheated because they were born in principle into a society in which they were supposed to be safe. The gay world as such is no more prepared to accept Black people than anywhere else in society. It is a very hermetically sealed world with very unattractive features, including racism." So I'd like to give you all a moment to think about how your privilege or disadvantage, or the combination of the two that you experience, has impacted your expectations of how you should feel walking around in the world. Maybe you can think of a time where you were surprised or even outraged when your expectations weren't met. And has that sense of outrage or surprise been from feeling cheated out of an experience you felt entitled to? Have you ever felt exempt from being racist, or specifically anti-Black racist, because of a different marginalized identity that you have? I'll give you all a moment to think about that. So I think the parallels between 1969 Stonewall riots and 2020 are pretty clear. People in 1969 criticized the Stonewall riots for being too violent, too extreme, radical, inappropriate. And yet we celebrate the Stonewall today as essential to the existence of pride. We celebrate it as essential to the existence of LGBTQ rights today. So as I was thinking about who to highlight in terms of influential Black LGBTQ people in history, it seemed insane to me not to include two of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza on the left and Patrisse Cullors on the right, and Opal Tometi in the middle there. You know, we always talk about the importance of representation and having representation in spaces of all levels. And I think this is Black Lives Matter is a really great example of how powerful that can be. From the start, Black Lives Matter has always been very intentional about including LGBTQ voices and putting them in the conversation. If you go to their website, they have this value statement. The second value statement on their website is, "We affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements." So thinking about the impacts of these women and Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement have had on our society is obviously this enormous thing that I could not possibly capture in one slide or in a couple of minutes. But so thinking, I guess, first from a kind of superficial level, right? Black Lives Matter has had an immense cultural impact. They were the first social movement in history to successfully use the internet as a mass mobilization device. If you think about recent successes like #MeToo, #NeverAgain, those likely would not have existed, or at least not been as successful, or not existed in that capacity were it not for the groundwork that Black Lives Matter laid. And obviously, in a much more important sense, Black Lives Matter unrelenting work on the issue of police corruption and brutality has helped incite the release of unprecedented U.S. Department of Justice reports confirming widespread presence of police corruption across cities, major cities across the United States. Looking toward the future, right, this movement has really helped to spur a lot of the continuation of the civil rights movements, leading to a lot of organizations, governments, and nonprofits and private organizations as well to investigate their policies and make changes. So we hope that going forward, we can see policy changes to eliminate the disproportionate incarceration rates of Black people, eliminate the over and under policing of Black communities, the elimination of police brutality, which we know would have very tangible impacts on Black families' generational wealth.
Thank you, Sarah. Learning about other social movements have really helped demonstrate how our identities intersect and how oppressive systems have affected our populations and communities across the board. Let's have a look at Black identity in the workplace and school. When I think about Black identity, I think about the ability to be accepted, belong, and show up as your authentic self without facing discrimination, shame, or bias based on your ethnic traits in the workplace, in school, and in the world. Just being free. Doesn't that sound nice? Then I think about the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. And I think about how that is a direct connection with acceptance and how a person feels about themselves, their self-esteem, their self-love. I remember seeing that video of this 16-year-old African-American wrestler named Andrew Johnson, who was forced to cut his locks or forfeit his wrestling match. My stomach was in knots watching the video, and I could only imagine the shame he faced and what that shame did to his confidence and the love for his natural hair. Then we were given Hair Love, the 2019 American animated short film by Matthew H. Harry that received an Academy Award not only for the compelling and beautifully written short story, but the love that it showed and the effort to normalize Black hair and highlighting a key topic in every Black family, our hair, loving our hair, which is our crown. Next slide. So I would like to uplift activist State Senator Holly J. Mitchell. She was a leader in making California the first state to legally ban natural hair discrimination. She believed people should not be forced to divest themselves of their racial cultural identity by changing their natural hair in order to adapt to predominantly white spaces in the workplace or in school. The Crown Act was the first bill in American history to ban hair discrimination. Next slide. The Crown is an acronym. That means creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. 7 states have made the Crown Act law, and in 43 states, it is still legal to discriminate based on hair. Take a look at the map. Find your state. If your state is gray, the Crown Act has not been filed. If yellow, the Crown Act has been pre-filed. And if blue, the Crown Act has passed and is law. As an ally, you can support the Crown Act by writing to your legislators and school districts to move the Crown Act forward. Next slide. Now let's look at Blacks in the workplace and the racial pay gaps being the widest for employees with college degrees for various reasons, but mainly the higher the education, the more you must navigate predominantly white spaces and possibly encounter discrimination. Going a bit deeper, Black women face a double penalty in income, earning less due to both racial and gender disparities. Overall, when you look at the earnings of the Black family, for every dollar earned by the typical white household, the typical Black household earns only 59 cents. Next slide. Sorry. Looking at economics. So some of the factors related to Black wealth gap. White families through history have experienced generational wealth transfers in the form of real estate, and institutional practices such as redlining, under-evaluation of homes in majority Black neighborhoods, and predatory lending continue to intensify racial wealth disparities. The failure to fully address these inequities further sustains the wealth gap from generation to generation. As you see a number of college graduates and Blacks with degrees, you also see a high debt in student loan debt of those college students. And the number one reason why we must challenge discriminatory policies and practices is due to this. The wealth gap with families between Black and white is just way too wide to have bias in any of our policies and practices. Next slide. So it's time to reflect. I'll read a quote by Senator Holly Mitchell, and then just go over some of the stats around how Black women have felt in the workplace. U.S. history, laws, and societal norms have equated Blackness and the associated physical traits to a badge of inferiority, unequal treatment, and bias. This perspective has also permeated the workplace and school regarding natural hair textures and styles, where professionalism was and still is closely linked to European features and mannerisms. For years, we've heard unsolicited statements from coworkers as well as hiring managers and have felt the need to succumb to a notion that our natural hair was less than professional or simply just not good enough. Black women are 80% more likely than white women to agree with this statement. I have to change my hair from its natural state to fit in at the office. Black women are 1 in 5 times more likely to be sent home from the workplace because of their hair. Now I ask you to reflect. Is hair discrimination the new race discrimination? What actions can you take to remove bias and foster a culture of belonging?
Thank you, Dorothea. Okay, so throughout this presentation, you were asked to do some reflections. And thank you for that and taking the polls. So now I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different. I'm going to ask you to go from reflection to putting in place a plan of action. So whenever I speak to my non-Black friends about Black history, race, racism, anti-racism, or anything along that subject matter, they just look so overwhelmed. Like the topic is so big. They often ask me, what can I do? What can I do being one person? And the way I've been responding is by asking them or working with them to make a small personalized plan. So that's what I offered to you all today. So you might have reflected and then asked yourself, what one thing can I do with my reflections? And my answer is that you can act. You can become an activist in place. By doing one of the 4 things listed on the slide or taking action on one of the reflection items, you can put together a plan of something that you can do tonight, tomorrow, or even next week. So just to recap, the reflections that were on the earlier slides. What did you learn? When did you learn about colonization? And so then my question to you would be, what will you do to decolonize your education? What area or subject matter or what person will you do a deep dive research into tomorrow, next week, next month to fill in the blanks? Because I can tell you that there are blanks in what we're taught in our educational system. Of the common systems of oppression that were discussed today, which system still exists? What actions will you take today to help expose, eradicate, or dismantle those systems? Or how does your privilege impact your expectations for how you should be treated? And then what do you plan to do today, tomorrow, next month to help level the playing field for a coworker or a friend or family member? What will you do to make space for marginalized individuals? And then, is hair discrimination really the new race discrimination? Is it more subtle? Is it more acceptable in terms of a form of discrimination? What can you do today or tomorrow? Will you write to your legislators and advocate for passing the Crown Act? And then on the slide, we have other options. You can volunteer. You can look up the mutual aid fund in your area. They provide direct support to vulnerable communities, especially in the age of, the pandemic. You could look up the Unite the Dream. You can volunteer, you can offer your time, you can make donations. You could expand your perspective. Follow Black LGBTQ folks on your social media. Kenny Ethan Jones, Gabriel Alexa are 2 notable people that you can follow. You can donate, you can get involved with Black LGBTQ organizations like the National Black Justice Coalition, or you can support the Crown Act. The choice is yours. Next slide. So we do have some upcoming events, but one of the things that in putting together this presentation, and one of the things that I want to ask the presenters, we covered a lot of things that had historical significance, many things that are still occurring currently. And I'm always curious because we put together these presentations and then we debrief our prep and we debrief, our dry runs. And I always find so much value in going through one another and just kind of sharing of ourselves. Like, as Sarah mentioned at the opening, is that we're not scholars, right? As we're GIS people, we're normal people. We're just trying our best to be activists in place. But we learn so much when we do these presentations. And so we've asked you to reflect on what we presented, what we shared. And I'm going to ask the presenters to reflect on what they may have learned through this process. And I will start and then I will turn it over because I did learn. I learned a lot about anti-Black racism that exists in different groups. I was able to make connections between my high school education, Karamatsu versus the United States, understanding why Asian Americans were brought to this country, helping to build the transcontinental railroad, and the connection with the ending of slavery in America. So I'm just astounded by how much we are, or we have to be, lifetime learners. So that's what I reflected on during this process. Anybody else want to jump in? Reflection of your own?
I guess just kind of building off of what you just said, Aisha, I think, you know, when we're taught history, it's all piecemeal, right? Like it's like, you know, you learn about these like events in history and not so much always the why behind them, or the influences, or the things that premeditated the, you know, what you learn. And there was just so much in terms of what the other three, you know, presenters shared that like I just had no idea about. Like you said, like I learned a lot about you know, the Asian migration into the US and the Exclusion Acts and all these things, but their relations to Black history and the relationships with, you know, the way that the Black Panther Party influenced all these other, you know, racial and ethnic groups, I had no idea. And it was just really, yeah, like a kind of a paradigm shift for me.
Anyone else care to share a reflection?
I would say for me, something that I learned throughout the research process, since we had to omit so much stuff for the sake of time, was it just really drove home the idea of, I understand the model minority myth and how that's used to just pit Asian groups against other groups, but I didn't realize that historically, you know, the acceptance of Asian Americans in the US, it was extremely strategic. It was only motivated by political reasons, and usually not positive ones, usually just needing more bodies to do jobs that weren't safe or were no one else wanted to do. So I think the thing that I want to end on as far as Asian American past history and the future goes is like how we can't forget this history. It's so intertwined with other communities, and like the struggle for freedom from these systems, that has to be mutual on our part, and we can't forget that we wouldn't be able to be where we are without being uplifted by so many other groups. So I definitely encourage people to continue learning and continue trying to do your own research. And I think, oh, it looks like there is a raised hand. I'm sorry, I'm not adminning this. Any thoughts, Aisha or Clinton?
Can we type the raised hand, and we'll read the comment?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Were there any other reflections? Feel free to drop them in the chat. Any other panelists who had thoughts on this?
Yeah, just from my side, hearing all of the presenters and how we really tied in, you know, that shared history. I did not know anything about the Asian Pacific Islander history. So I love the timeline because it really helped to, you know, place events. But it was really great, and it helps to understand, you know, how movements impact and has a domino effect on other movements. And it was really great. So I appreciate it.
I think for me, I definitely learned a lot. And then the other thing that was interesting was to see the different movements and how they were happening at the same time across the US, and how, at least specifically, there was a lot of focus into the Chicano movement in California, but also it was great to learn about Los Siete de la Raza and the other movements that were going on that weren't just for Mexican Americans. And it's just so interesting how all of these groups were fighting the same systems of oppression that they were fighting. And as I was reading about school segregations, one of the things that personally I found quite hurtful was that they said that school segregation for Mexicans was very important because they needed to get Americanized. and they didn't speak English, and therefore they sort of implied that they weren't as smart as kids that spoke English. So this is very interesting because I think a lot of the different generations have this belief that their English needs to be perfect in order to appear very smart. So this is something that, whether we wish to admit it or not, we carry with us generation through generation. And this whole idea to get Americanized goes back to the assimilation process, right? So that was one of the things that I found very interesting, among many other things, right? Because there's so many history here.
Okay, do we have the question in the chat? I see.
I think Clinton was able to enable them to unmute. So she should be able to speak now.
Okay, is that Cheryl?
Yeah. Hi, Cheryl. Feel free to unmute if you're able to.
Okay, all right, so I'm just going to read the question. Okay, so the question is, will the presentation be posted afterwards? Well, that one's easy. Yes. Yes, we will post the recording of the presentation once we are done. And then a question from Cola. History has changed so much, or is, okay, this might be a comment. History has changed so much. Black history was not taught when I was going to school. A lot of the facts were even hidden. I was in with immigrant students, and so I would agree. I know, so growing up as a Black child, I'm pretty sure my parents already knew that there were gaps in education, and my parents, each Black History Month, each kind of major family gathering holiday, they would give us a task of doing reports. And so we were, as part of our yearly annual routine in my family, we would research Black historical figures, those that were known and those that were not always well known and talked about in school. So my parents approached my education with the understanding that there were gaps, obvious gaps, and we worked as a Black family, and I suspect as a Black community, to fill in those gaps for our young people. The question is, why is it so hard for people of color and marginalized individuals to unite? Anybody want to take that? My cynical side says things may be working as they were designed to work by founding the founding majority group in the country. I think, as Chloe mentioned, the politicization of Asian Americans being brought over into the country to work the railroads, and the model minority myth would be examples of systems working the way that they were designed. And I think that, you know, due to groups like the ones that are presented here, we're working together to overcome some of those systems and dismantle them. And so when we talk about going from reflection into action, those are some of the ways that we can actually implement change. Once you're aware the systems of oppression, it becomes kind of intuitive, the different ways that you can break them down. And it is not easy. It requires a lot of bravery. I think it's really brave. The people who have put together this entire series, you know, we have to go deep into ourselves to acknowledge some of our own biases, and then to bring forth the programming that we're seeing here. We're being really intentional about some of it. I hope that answered your question. Okay, so if you enjoyed what you've seen today, we do have some upcoming events that we'd like to share, kind of going on with the Black History Month, the theme for Black History Month. We have My Journey into GIS, a career, My Journey into GIS as a career, the African story, and that is February 19th, 9 to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Who Maps the Black Family? Impact of Bias in Data, Design, and Analysis. That event is happening February 26th, 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then Learn and Share, Innovative Minds, February 26th, 11 through 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we thank you for sharing your part of your Friday with us, and we hope you enjoy your long weekend. Thank you.